Welcome to Hope Stories. What would you do if a child, barefoot and trembling, looked you straight in the eye and asked for something no wallet could truly buy? Dignity, safety, a chance to live without fear. Sometimes the most life-changing promises don't come from contracts or courts, but from the lips of someone too young to carry the weight of survival. This is not a fairy tale, and it's not a story about easy charity. It's about a collision between despair and compassion, where one choice shatters silence and forces strangers to decide if they will remain strangers or become something far more dangerous, far more powerful: family. At its heart lies a haunting question. Are we saving them, or are they saving us? And the answer will take you into places both heartbreaking and unexpectedly beautiful, where love is tested against fear and survival is rewritten by trust. Now, step with me into the story. Ethan's bare feet slapped against the polished linoleum of the Walmart aisle, his 9-year-old arms wrapped tightly around his baby brother. Mason's cries were thin and piercing, a desperate sound that made strangers turn their heads and then look quickly away. Ethan's eyes, wide and dark with exhaustion, fixed on a man adjusting the cuff of his tailored shirt, a man who seemed completely out of place among the clearance bins and fluorescent light. Mr. Carter, 42 years old, clean-cut, a face made for boardrooms and glossy magazine spreads. He had come here to buy bottled water before his next meeting, not to be ambushed by a barefoot child begging for formula. "Please, sir," Ethan whispered. The words barely carried, but in the strange silence that fell between them, it sounded louder than any shout. Shoppers stopped mid-stride. A phone rose discreetly to capture the moment. For Carter, the child's plea struck harder than he expected, an echo of something buried under years of power lunches and silent penthouses. He had built his life on transactions, clean deals with signed contracts. But this was not a transaction. This was a demand from humanity itself. Rachel, the boy's mother, appeared at the end of the aisle, her hair damp with rain, her arms trembling from holding herself together. She had once been vibrant, ambitious, but depression had carved the color from her face and left her moving like a ghost through the world. She tried to reach Ethan, to silence him, but the boy refused to let go of Mason, refused to bow his head. His words carried the defiance of someone far older. "I'll pay you back when I grow up, I promise." Carter should have walked away. He almost did. Yet he found himself lowering to one knee so he could meet the boy's eyes at level, something he hadn't done with anyone in years. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the formula on the shelf. A promise is worth more than cash if you mean it. He didn't know why he said it. Maybe because he needed to hear it himself. Rain hit like needles when they left the store. Carter gave them more than just milk. He booked a room at a cheap motel, bought diapers, handed over warm food in paper bags. It was supposed to be temporary, a gesture. Yet when Rachel finally whispered, "Thank you," her voice cracked like glass and something inside him shifted. He told himself it was pity, nothing more. But as he left them that night, Mason asleep for the first time in days, he realized he had not slept without pills in years. That night, he did. The next morning, he returned. He told himself it was only to check, only to see if the baby was still alive, if the boy had kept his strange promise. But when Rachel opened the door, her eyes held the wary fire of someone who had been disappointed too many times. Carter could have turned away then. Instead, he revealed the truth he had hidden from himself for a decade. He had once had a wife, Helena, who believed kindness mattered more than wealth. She was gone now, 10 years buried, but in the boy's trembling voice and Rachel's exhausted grace, he saw the ghost of what he had lost. That day he offered them more than food. He offered them a key. The key to a modest apartment in Brooklyn that had belonged to his late Aunt Margaret, a woman who had spent her life sheltering others. The place had been empty for a year, a silent museum of lost laughter. He told Rachel they could live there, not as charity, but as guardians. She asked him why. "Because," he answered, voice breaking against his will, "helping you reminds me that I'm still alive." Rachel pressed her lips together, torn between pride and desperation. Ethan clutched the key like it was gold. Mason gurgled, oblivious, but when Carter looked down at the baby, he swore he saw recognition in those tiny eyes, as if the child understood that something irreversible had just happened. By the time they stepped into that apartment, the air itself seemed to exhale. Sunlight poured over the worn furniture. Ethan ran to the window, calling out that he could see kids playing in the park. Rachel touched the walls with reverence, as though afraid they might dissolve. Carter, watching from the doorway, felt his chest tighten, not from doubt, but from the terrifying clarity that he needed them as much as they needed him. He had entered the store that night as a man immune to pleas. He left it now as something else, a guardian, perhaps, or a man daring to hope that promises, even those spoken by a child, might still be kept. Would you have trusted a stranger's promise if it came from a starving child's lips? Could accepting such help ever heal wounds deeper than hunger? Because in that silent apartment in Brooklyn, a single key had opened not just a door, but a future none of them had expected to share. The apartment in Brooklyn quickly filled with the sound of small feet and hesitant laughter, but beneath the fragile joy lay cracks Carter could not ignore. Ethan carried his school books to the kitchen table each night, his thin shoulders hunched with determination to catch up on the months he had missed. Mason, healthier with each passing day, toddled through the rooms like he had always belonged there. Rachel kept the place immaculate, scrubbing counters until her hands were raw, as if cleanliness itself might silence the shame of all the nights she had failed to give her children a roof. Yet Carter noticed the way she avoided mirrors, the way she bit back tears when Ethan called him sir too often, as though waiting for the moment this fragile arrangement would collapse. One evening, over cheap takeout cartons spread across the small coffee table, Rachel spoke without lifting her eyes. "How long do we have here?" Carter froze mid-bite. He had given them no deadline, no conditions beyond respect and care, yet her tone carried the desperation of someone waiting for the axe to fall. He answered softly, "As long as you need." She looked up then, her gaze sharp. "Don't lie to me. Nothing in life is free. Not homes, not kindness, not men like you." The words cut deeper than he expected. He realized with a jolt that she didn't mistrust him alone. She mistrusted herself, her ability to hold this new life together. That night, Carter lay awake in his sterile condo across the river, the silence pressing on him. He hadn't told them the truth. The apartment wasn't simply an empty property. It was where Aunt Margaret had spent her final years, where she had filled every corner with the belief that broken people deserved second chances. Carter had inherited it, but he had been unable to step inside after her death, unwilling to hear the echoes of her laughter in rooms she had left behind. Giving it to Rachel and her children felt like honoring her memory, but it also opened a wound he had buried. He could still hear Margaret's last words. "You'll never find peace hiding behind money." Now he wondered if sheltering this family was his penance or his salvation. The next day, as Ethan unpacked his new school supplies, Carter noticed a notebook filled with writing. Short stories, pages upon pages of words scrawled in the careful hand of a boy who had seen too much. Ethan flushed when Carter picked it up. "It's nothing, just things I make up." But Carter recognized something powerful, a voice raw and unpolished, the same way Helena, his late wife, had once written letters to him, letters that now sat sealed in a box he hadn't dared to open since her death. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Ethan's promise in the supermarket had sounded like a child's fantasy. But what if this boy could actually keep it, not with money, but with words? What if his stories were the repayment? The thought stirred something dangerous in Carter, hope. That hope was tested days later when Rachel returned from her first counseling appointment. She seemed lighter, almost relieved, until she asked him for a timeline. 6 months. That's all I need. By then I'll have a job and we'll pay rent. Carter wanted to argue, to tell her there was no deadline, but her insistence revealed a deeper truth. She could not live in a gift forever. Pride burned in her, even through her exhaustion. If he denied her that dignity, she might walk away. Later that night, Carter admitted something he had never said aloud, even to himself. "I lost someone I loved 10 years ago. She believed that love only mattered if it was given freely. And I forgot that." His voice cracked, but he did not look away. Rachel's eyes softened, but Ethan's narrowed with something sharper. "So are we just your way of remembering her? Or are we us?" The question left Carter stunned. From the mouth of a child came the accusation he most feared, that this was not real, that they were stand-ins for ghosts. For the first time since he met them, Carter had no answer. Do you believe Carter is helping this family out of love or out of guilt for his past? Because the next decision he makes will test whether their fragile new life is built on truth or on a lie waiting to shatter them all. Carter began visiting the apartment more often, telling himself it was to check if the bills were paid or if Rachel needed groceries. But the truth was simpler. He couldn't stay away. The silence of his own penthouse felt heavier now, almost hostile, and every time he stepped into that Brooklyn apartment and heard Mason's laughter or Ethan's voice reading aloud from his notebook, it was as if life itself seeped back into his bones. But with each visit, the line between guardian and intruder blurred. Rachel appreciated his help, yet Carter could sense the way her shoulders stiffened when he lingered too long, when his eyes lingered on the photograph she had started taping to the wall. Pictures of Ethan smiling in his school uniform, Mason crawling across the floor, tiny fragments of a normal life being stitched together without him at the center. The tension broke one Saturday morning when Rachel found an envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a card from Child Protective Services. Someone had reported her. The words leapt off the page. Concerns about a single mother, unstable mental health, children exposed to unconventional arrangements. Rachel's face went pale, and Carter felt the air drain from the room. "They'll take my boys," she whispered, her hands trembling so violently the paper rattled. Carter tried to reassure her, but he knew how quickly the system moved. He had seen it before in boardrooms. Once a file was opened, it had its own momentum. Ethan, overhearing everything, clenched his fists. "Is this because of you?" he demanded, his young voice sharp with betrayal. "People see you coming here all the time. They think you're buying us." The accusation sliced Carter open. He wanted to deny it, to shout that this was about love, not ownership, but the boy's words struck a nerve. Was that what it looked like? A rich man collecting a broken family like another acquisition? The truth he feared was that maybe part of him had believed proximity could erase loneliness, that by saving them he might save himself. That night, Carter drove aimlessly through the city, Helena's memory haunting him in every red light. He remembered how she had once dreamed of adopting, how she had insisted that love was not measured by blood, but by the willingness to fight for someone else's future. He had dismissed her then, buried in his empire of numbers and contracts. And now, 10 years too late, here he was, stumbling into the same, except the world was watching and judging. Rachel, meanwhile, spiraled into panic. She had been clawing her way back to stability, attending therapy, applying for work, regaining fragments of herself. Now, the threat of losing her children threatened to unravel everything. When Carter arrived the next morning, she was sitting on the floor, clutching Mason to her chest, whispering over and over, "They're mine! They're mine!" Ethan stood guard beside her, eyes filled with the same fire that had burned in the supermarket that first night. Carter made a choice then, one that both terrified and liberated him. He called a lawyer he trusted, a man who had guided him through corporate battles, and asked for something personal, something he had never imagined requesting. Custody protections, legal guardianship options, a way to shield the family from being torn apart. The lawyer hesitated. "This isn't a contract you can rewrite if it goes wrong. If you step into this, you step in for life." Carter looked at Ethan, at Mason's tiny hand gripping Rachel's shirt, and realized the boy's question still hung in the air. Was he doing this for them or for himself? The answer was brutal in its simplicity. Both. He needed them as much as they needed him. But need was not enough. It had to become commitment, carved into law, into permanence. When he told Rachel his plan, she recoiled. "You want custody? After everything, you think I'd hand my children to you?" Her voice was steel, yet her eyes shimmered with something else. Fear, not of losing control to him, but of losing the fragile dignity she had rebuilt. Carter didn't flinch. "Not custody to take them from you. Custody to protect them with you, to make sure no one can ever break this apart." The silence that followed was unbearable. Ethan broke it first. "If you do this, then it's forever. You won't walk away like other people." Carter swallowed hard. Forever was the one word he had avoided for a decade, maybe, the word Helena had once whispered on their wedding day. Now it returned, heavy and inescapable, demanding to be answered. If you were Rachel, would you trust Carter's offer as protection or fear it as another form of control? Because in that small Brooklyn apartment, with the law now closing in, one decision will decide whether they remain a family or fracture under the weight of suspicion and doubt. The knock on the door came just after sunset, 3 sharp raps that froze the air in the Brooklyn apartment. Rachel's body tensed immediately. Mason stirred in her arms. Ethan glanced toward Carter with eyes wide and unblinking. On the other side stood a woman in a gray coat, clipboard in hand, her tone clipped but polite. "Child Protective Services. I need to speak with Miss Rachel Daniels." The walls seemed to contract. Rachel's face drained of color, her hand tightening around the baby, as though the stranger might reach through the doorway and take him. Carter stepped forward, his voice steady but cold. "You don't come in without a warrant." The worker didn't flinch. "A report was filed. The children's welfare must be assessed." Rachel, her voice trembling, whispered, "If I refuse, they'll think I'm hiding something." The truth in her words twisted Carter's stomach. They let her in. She walked through each room methodically, noting the baby supplies, the modest but clean kitchen, the homework spread neatly on the table. Ethan followed her like a shadow, ready to protest if she touched anything, while Rachel answered questions with a forced calm that threatened to splinter. When the worker asked about Carter, the room went still. Rachel opened her mouth, but Ethan spoke first. "He saved us." The declaration hung in the air, fierce and unpolished. The worker scribbled something down, her expression unreadable. "We'll be in touch," she said at last, and when the door closed, the silence it left behind was unbearable. That night Rachel broke. "This is because of you," she said, her voice rising, her hands shaking as she paced the living room. "Your visits, your money, your presence. They think I've sold my children for survival." Carter wanted to protest, but she pressed on, tears streaming. "You promised us safety, but instead you've put us under a microscope. I can't lose them, Carter. I can't." He had faced corporate rivals, ruthless negotiations, even the empty silence of grief, but never this. A woman tearing herself open in front of him, accusing him not of cruelty, but of care that might destroy. Later, alone in his car, Carter felt Helena's ghost pressing in again. She had always believed that helping others demanded sacrifice, that love was not safe but dangerous, a leap without a net. He realized then that his entire life since her death had been a barricade against that truth. Giving Rachel the apartment, buying milk for Ethan, even calling the lawyer, these were not sacrifices but controlled gestures, ways of protecting himself from real risk. Now the risk had arrived, in the form of the state, ready to tear apart the fragile family that had become his reason to breathe. The next day, Carter made a decision that stunned even himself. He called Rachel in the kitchen, the morning light cutting across his face, and placed a set of papers on the table. "Legal documents, notarized, binding. If they question your stability, then we'll give them what they don't expect. A partnership. I'll co-sign custody. You keep your children, and no one can accuse you of being alone." Rachel stared at the papers as if they were a snake ready to strike. "You're asking me to tie my life to yours, legally, permanently. Do you know what you're doing?" Carter's answer was quiet but firm. "I know that if I don't, they will take everything from you, from us." Ethan, listening from the hallway, stepped into the room, his voice shaking but clear. "If you sign that, then you're not just helping us anymore. You're family." His words were a gift and a warning all at once. Rachel's hand hovered above the papers, her eyes full of fear, hope, and suspicion. She whispered, "And if this is just your guilt talking, what happens when you regret it?" Carter's heart thundered, the weight of a decade of grief pressing on him. He met her gaze and said the only truth he had left, "Then I'll spend the rest of my life proving I don't." If you were Rachel, would you sign those papers and trust Carter's promise, or would you fear the cost of binding your life to his? Because as her pen hovered above the line, the choice between freedom and survival became a razor's edge, and the future of their fragile family balanced on a single stroke of ink. Rachel didn't sign the papers that day. She pressed the pen cap closed with trembling fingers and slid the folder back toward Carter, her eyes swimming with conflict. "I can't," she whispered. "Not yet. If I sign this now, it feels like I'm admitting I can't stand on my own, that I'll always need you to fix things." Her voice cracked, and Ethan, standing close by, looked down at the floor, torn between relief and disappointment. Carter said nothing at first. He only watched her, the weight of her words pressing harder than any contract he had ever negotiated. The following week, Child Protective Services returned. This time, the questions were sharper, the tone colder. Rachel was asked about her employment prospects, her mental health records, the children's daily care. The worker even asked Ethan if he ever felt unsafe at home. The boy clenched his jaw, answering with a defiance that bordered on dangerous. "The only time I felt unsafe was before we met him." The worker wrote furiously, leaving behind an unease that settled into every corner of the apartment. That night, Carter confronted his own fear. If CPS decided Rachel was unfit, the children could be taken into foster care. He could fight it legally, but that fight would expose them to scrutiny, headlines, gossip. He had spent years protecting his name and business, but now his reputation might be their undoing. For the first time in his career, the prospect of losing a battle wasn't about shareholders. It was about losing a family that had never been his to begin with. Rachel, meanwhile, carried a storm inside her. Therapy was helping, yes, but the pressure from CPS reignited old wounds. She began waking in the night, pacing the apartment, whispering prayers she didn't believe in anymore. Carter found her one dawn at the kitchen sink, her face pale, her eyes hollow. "Maybe they're right," she said. "Maybe I am unfit. Maybe the best thing for them is someone else." Carter's voice, hoarse with emotion, broke the stillness. "Don't you dare believe that. You are their mother. You are the reason they've survived this long." But even as he said it, he saw the doubt lingering in her eyes, a doubt no reassurance could erase. The twist came 2 days later. Ethan brought home a flyer from school, a citywide writing competition. His teacher had encouraged him to enter, impressed by his stories. He showed it to Carter in secret, excitement flickering in his eyes. "If I win, people will know we're not broken. They'll know we belong here." But Rachel discovered the flyer tucked under his pillow and erupted. "No, Ethan, you're not parading our pain for strangers to judge. We've been humiliated enough." Her words were sharp, almost cruel, and Ethan stormed into his room, slamming the door. Mason began to cry, and the fragile harmony of the apartment fractured in an instant. Later, Carter approached Rachel quietly. "He needs this," he said. "It's not about pity. It's about voice. Don't take that from him." But Rachel's fear boiled over. "Easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like to have every part of your life dissected, to have strangers decide if you're worthy to keep your children. If Ethan stands up and shares our story, it won't just be his words. It will be proof for them to use against me." The truth in her panic left Carter speechless. For the first time, he wondered if helping Ethan might hurt Rachel. And for the first time, he questioned whether his loyalty belonged to the mother trying to protect her dignity or the boy trying to reclaim his future. If you were Carter, would you risk supporting Ethan's dream, even if it meant jeopardizing Rachel's fragile stability? Because in that moment, Carter realized that choosing one meant betraying the other, and the cost of either choice could shatter the family he was desperate to hold together. Ethan did enter the contest. He waited until Carter came by one evening and slipped the pages into his hand, whispering, "If she says no, will you still help me?" Carter read the words late that night in his condo, and for the first time in years, he cried without shame. Ethan hadn't written about hunger or shame, but about promises, the kind that save lives, the kind that tether strangers together until they feel like blood. The boy's voice was raw but undeniable. Carter knew then that holding him back would be as cruel as abandoning him in that supermarket aisle. When Rachel discovered Ethan had submitted his story anyway, her fury burned hot. "You've gone behind my back," she shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. Ethan stood his ground. "You're scared, Mom, but if we keep hiding, they win. We're not broken. We're not something to be ashamed of." Mason cried from the next room, and Rachel pressed her palms to her face, sobbing, not only from anger, but from the terrible knowledge that her son was right. Carter stood at the doorway, torn between stepping in or letting them battle it out. In that moment, he saw both sides, the mother desperate to protect what little she had rebuilt, and the boy desperate to prove he could build something bigger than survival. Weeks later, Ethan's name was announced among the finalists. He would read his piece aloud at the public library downtown. Rachel almost refused to go until Ethan left a note on the kitchen table. "You taught me to fight, Mom. Please let me." When the night came, the library lights glowed like a cathedral. Rows of families and teachers filled the seats, the air buzzing with expectation. Ethan walked to the podium, hands trembling but voice steady as he read his story about a barefoot boy in a supermarket who promised to repay kindness one day. Carter watched Rachel in the audience, her face pale, her hands gripping Mason's tiny fingers. But when Ethan reached the final line, "Sometimes saving someone else is how you save yourself," Carter saw her chest rise with a deep, shuddering breath, as though a stone had finally been lifted. The applause was thunderous. Ethan did not win first prize, but it did not matter. A journalist approached afterward, intrigued by his words, asking to feature him in a human interest column. Rachel panicked, fearing headlines, exposure, the return of scrutiny. But something had shifted. She looked at Carter, then at Ethan, and whispered, "All right, let the world hear him." It was not surrender, but acceptance, that hiding would never keep them safe, only truth could. CPS never returned. Perhaps they saw the progress, or perhaps Carter's lawyer had worked quietly behind the scenes. Rachel secured a steady job at a small accounting office. Mason grew into a lively toddler who followed his brother everywhere, and Ethan, though still carrying scars, became the boy who looked forward instead of backward. Carter kept coming, never forcing himself into their rhythm, but never pulling away. He was no longer a savior trying to control the outcome, but a man learning how to belong. Years later, when Ethan stood at a high school graduation podium as valedictorian, Rachel wept openly, clutching Mason's hand. Carter stood beside them, his hair streaked with gray, his eyes filled with the kind of pride he thought he had buried with Helena. After the ceremony, Ethan pressed an envelope into his hand. Inside was a typed page, signed at the bottom, "Paid in full." Carter looked up, confused, and Ethan smiled. "That was the promise, wasn't it? I told you I'd pay you back when I grew up." "And I did. With words. With us." Carter pulled him into an embrace, unable to speak. Rachel stood nearby, no longer the fragile woman of that supermarket night, but a mother who had fought her way back to dignity. Mason, now old enough to understand, grinned and said, "Guess that means we're all square now." They laughed, but Carter shook his head, his voice finally breaking free. "No, boys, this debt was never about money. It was about love, and I'll be repaying that until my last breath." The family walked together into the warm evening light, no longer bound by fear or contracts, but by something stronger, chosen love, forged in fire, unshakable as blood. What did this story make you feel, and how would you describe its message in your own words? If you love this journey, comment 100 below. Tell us which country you are watching from, and share this story with your friends so more people can feel its hope. Thank you for watching Hope Stories.